here all the time. I hunker in my bunker. I was asked to speak to you about the topic of telling truth to power. And there are...
Oh dear, somebody is unmuted perhaps. Try again, Rabbi.
Does that make it better?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I think I pushed some button. I was asked to speak about truth to power. And I'm going to be taking the topic tonight of King David. And next week I'll be speaking about King Ahab. These were two Jewish kings. David has been very much sanctified by Jewish tradition. We've taken David and made him into a Jewish saint, which I might add is pretty funny since the Catholic Church has officially made him into a saint, and he is Saint David. And for those of you who know the West Windsor Catholic Church, it is Saint David the King, or as I used to tell Father John, David HaMelech. King David was not a saint. He was a tough, powerful monarch. We'll talk about why he was made into a saint perhaps another day, or if we have time at the end when I'm done, I can go through that with you. But the fact is, if you read the biblical stories about David, he doesn't come off as quite the saint that later Jewish history has made him. Now, you remember we began way back in Mesopotamia, in the city of Ur. Ur is the Babylonian word for the Hebrew word Ir, which means the city. Some people think that means New York, but in this case, it just meant a city in Babylonia called the city. One of the inhabitants of that city, a man by the name of Abraham, was singled out by God and told to drop out of Babylonian society, which he did. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, you know the story. Anyway, sometime approximately in the year 1650 BCE, the Israelite people found themselves in Egypt. Read the stories of Joseph. And the Egyptians dealt ill with us, and they made us slaves for 400 years. That quickly brings us to the year 1250 BCE. And if you saw the movie The Ten Commandments, you know that Charlton Heston led the Israelites out of slavery and into the Promised Land. We lived as a group of wild and disparate tribes for a time. And finally, around the year 1030 BCE, around the year 1030, we elected a man from the tribe of Benjamin as our king. This fellow's name was Shaul, Saul. He was the first king of Israel. It is not an accident that he was elected from the tribe of Benjamin, because it was the littlest and weakest tribe, and we Jews didn't really want a king. We don't trust authority. We are antinomian. Some would say we are stiff-necked. God and Moses say we are stiff-necked, and they're right most of the time. We're a pretty pernicious group. We don't like authority. However, we elected Saul king because the Philistines were a greater threat. Saul ruled for approximately 30 years. Saul's rule was undermined by his son-in-law, who did him in and did his best to undermine the rule of Saul. That fellow was named David. Approximately the year 1000 BCE, King David took the Jebusite city of Jerusalem in the middle of the 12 tribes and made that his capital. We like to think of David as the sweet singer of Israel, the writer of the Psalms. We remember David as a long-reigning monarch who brought peace and stability to Israel by defeating the Philistines, subduing the Canaanites. Having said all that, David was powerful, but the stories make it quite clear that he was a ruthless king who terrified his enemies and his population into submission. I jokingly tell everybody when I do the 23rd Psalm that, we read a version which is not what King David really wrote. What King David really wrote for the 23rd Psalm was, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for I am the meanest and nastiest guy in the valley." That's a joke. It's not true. The editor made him tone it down, and if you look at David's reign, you'll see that my joke is not far off the mark. David was a powerful king. David ruled Jerusalem. He took the city from the Canaanites and he rebuilt the city into a fortress, into his personal city with his own palace and a big temple. Now, you have to picture the city of Jerusalem. It is on a hill that goes like this. This is the north. This is the south. Actually, I suppose we should do it this way because the north goes into a plain. So here's the north, here's the south, and all around is a valley. So that Jerusalem is pretty impregnable. It was, of course, impregnable until King David took it. David took the city, slaughtered the inhabitants, moved his people in, and it became his capital city because it wasn't owned by any one of the 12 tribes. David was sending a very clear message that he would not be beholden to any tribe and that he alone was the power in Israel. The 12 tribes submitted to him. Pretty much. There were always a few revolts and always some problems. So let's look at our city of Jerusalem. The population lived in this part, down here. Then right about here, David built his palace. So his palace was at the top of the hill, looking down on all of the population, all the houses. And right above David's palace was the temple that he built for God. And then the city walls were like this. So that Jerusalem sloped down from the temple to David's palace to the city and the population. This is important because, in case you haven't figured it out, Israel is hot. And in the summer, it gets hot. I used to say hot as hell. I don't say that anymore. Now I just say hot as Masada, because it gets as hot as Masada in the summer. Therefore, people wouldn't stay indoors. During the day, they would stay indoors because the mud huts and the brick huts would keep the cool. But at night, people would come up on their roof. And the roofs were all flat. Needless to say, it never snows in Israel. And so they would all spend their evenings actually cooking and living up on the roof. And on the roof, David could see from his palace right here, everybody's roof all down the city. And that's going to be the premise of our story about King David and a woman named Bathsheba and a prophet named Natan. To begin with, let me just give you a little vignette that really captures the spirit of our boy, King Dave. If you can look at the first book of Kings, chapter 2, verse 1. Can we have that up on the screen, please, John? When David's life was drawing to a close, he instructed his son Solomon as follows. Now he said this to Solomon in front of the whole palace. Everybody was watching. David was on his deathbed, lying on a couch, and all the people were watching him. And he calls forward his son, verse 2, and he says, I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself as a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and following his laws, his commandments, his rules and his admonitions, as recorded in the Torah of Moses, in order that you may succeed in whatever you do. Then the Lord will fulfill the promise that he made concerning me, if your descendants are scrupulous in their conduct and walk before me faithfully with all their heart and soul. Your line and the throne of Israel shall never end. Can we go further? Thank you. Okay. Isn't that nice? Dave's on his deathbed. You can flip us back to picture now. Dave's on his deathbed. He gathers all the court around him, and he pulls himself up, and he says, Solomon, my son, be good, to follow the Torah, do the right thing, be just, blah, blah, blah. Everything will be fine. And everybody is smiling. This is what you want your king to say as he gives his power to his son, right? Yeah, that's what King Dave says publicly. Now, let's go on to what he says privately to his son. To his son, he now says to him, Shloime, Shloime, come here. And he whispers to him, Shloime, you remember Joab, the son of Tzeruiah? What he did to me and the two commanders of Israel's force, Avner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Yeter? He killed them, shedding blood in war and peacetime, staining the girdle of his loins and the sandals of his feet with blood of war. Shloime, act in accordance with your wisdom and see that his white hair does not go down to Sheol in peace. Back to me, John. So what is he saying? He's saying, come here, Shloime. You see Joab over there standing in the court? Look at him. Smile, Shloime. As soon as I'm dead, I want you to kill him because he double-crossed me. You can't trust him. He's power hungry. And then he goes on and he says, but deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, sentence 6. Okay, we got 6 there? Yes. Why should we deal nice with Barzillai? For they befriended me when I fled from your brother Absalom. Let them be among those who sit at your table. So Shloime, don't look around, but I want you to look in the corner, and you'll see Shimi ben Gera. Oh no, excuse me. We'll see. Who is he talking about now? Oh, Barzillai from Gilead. You'll see Barzillai and his sons. You can trust them. They helped me. And then he says, Shloime, now look around and smile at Shimi ben Gera. You must deal with Shimi ben Gera from Benjamin. He insulted me outrageously when I was on my way to Machanaim. He came down to meet me at the Jordan, and I swore to him then by the Lord, I will not put you to the sword. You know why, Shloime? I was weak. I needed him. Now I don't need him anymore. Sentence 9. So do not let him go unpunished, for you are a wise man, and you will know how to deal with him. Send his gray hair down to Sheol in blood. Back to me, John. And that's how David dies. He makes a nice pronouncement to everybody about being good and moral, and then he brings Solomon close, and he says, kill Barzillai, or no, save Barzillai, but Joab and Shimi ben Gera kill them right away. You wonder where Mario Puzo got his scenes in The Godfather? He got them from King Dave, because King Dave was the Godfather. Any questions up to now?
We do have one. Well, we
Who is
do
that?
have one
What is
one question in the chat.
Sure.
That asks, didn't Solomon build a temple? You said before that.
Yes. Well, David started it. David started, Solomon built the temple. David was not able to finish the temple. He was not allowed to do that because he was his hands were covered with blood. But the temple, it's called the Temple of David and the Temple of Solomon. Solomon completed it, and Solomon did most of the work. But don't forget, David planned the city. And David planned where the temple was going to be up here at the top. Here's the wall. And then the temple was going to be here. It was not finished in David's day, but his palace was. So, but the whole focus of the city was down the hill. Now, let's go back to David's palace, because you get an insight into David's character. This guy is tough. He is a ruthless ruler. He was a good ruler for Israel, because let me tell you, we were tough. We were tough people. We were tough tribes, and he had to wield us together. And it took a strong king, and he did that. And he made Israel a great nation, and he did institute the Torah as the law of the land. But he just had a little problem with the fact that he was supposed to obey the Torah too. Because as the king, he felt it was his job to enforce the law on everybody else. And he could get away with whatever he could get away with. So, David was one night sitting in the evening on his balcony. If we go to chapter 11 we go to 2 Samuel, chapter 11, verse 2. 2 Samuel, chapter 11, verse 2. Late one afternoon, David arose from his couch and strolled on the roof of the royal palace. And from the roof, he looked down and he saw a woman bathing on her roof. And the woman was very beautiful. And the king sent, and he made inquiries about the woman. And it was reported back to him that she is Bathsheba, the son of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, he's not a Hittite. That's how we call him in English. He was a Chati from the Chatim, which was one of those crazy tribes running around Israel while we were there. There were a lot of Canaanites that we never wiped out, and the Chati were one of them. So Uriah, this non-Jew, is now working for King David in his army, and he has a beautiful wife named Bathsheba. David is having a war at this point, and his army is out fighting the people of Ammon. He's besieging the city of Rabbah, the capital of Ammon, and his army is over on the other side of the Jordan fighting. Dave is home running the country. Uriah is with the army. So David is now sitting home, and he sees Bathsheba. It's hot in the Middle East. All the homes have flat roofs. And once the sun went down, people would often cook and spend time and even sleep on the roof to avoid the heat, trapped in the clay houses all day. Being well-to-do and having servants, Bathsheba, we are told, would take her bath in the evening up on her roof. And it just so happened that it was always the time when the king would be sitting on his balcony, having a little shivas on rocks, thinking deep thoughts. Needless to say, Bathsheba noticed King David noticing. And it wasn't long before she was visiting the palace regularly to advise the king. Her husband's off to war, she's lonely, and she soon becomes pregnant. Okay. Now, David is a very powerful king, and there were not too many people who were about to oppose King David on anything, let alone mention anything like the affair he was having with a married woman who was the wife of a soldier who was loyally serving King David and his army. The king of Israel is supposed to be God's elected and a moral exemplar. You can come back to me, Jim. And one of the big 10 from Mount Sinai, you remember, is no adultery. So even King David had to pay some attention to that. And everybody knew, since Uriah was an officer, that he had been away from a long time. And a whole court was buzzing about the affair that he was having with Bathsheba anyway. And her expanding belly was just getting a little too hard to hide. There was controversy. Everybody's whispering, but nobody would confront David. No one would dare face his wrath. Therefore, David just decides, all right, I know how we deal with this. I'll just recall Uriah from the front, have him come home, give me a report, tell him go spend the night at home, and everyone will say the kid is his, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Who would question the king? Nobody who wants to continue living. So David sends word to the front, and he says, I need a report from my boy Uriah. And Joab, the commander, he says, have him come to report to me in person here in Jerusalem to tell me how the battle's going up at Ramah. And I can picture David smiling to himself as to how clever he was being. But things started to go wrong right away. King David writes to his general, Yoav ben Tzruya, you can see that in the text, we're not going to read it, and tells him that he wants Uriah to come home to give a report about how the battle is going. Yoav orders Uriah, the loyal soldier, to report right away to the king. So what does Uriah do? He runs home. The Torah tells us he's a loyal boy. His king needs a report. So he runs right back to Jerusalem, but does not stop to visit his wife. His king needs a report. He goes right to King David's court. He bursts in to make a formal report in front of everybody about the battle, how the battle is going, about how well Yoav, the commander, is doing, and blah, blah, blah. Okay. David listens to all this, and he can barely contain himself till he's done. And he says, you see in sentence 8, he says to him, Uriah, I'm tired. I don't want to listen anymore. Go back home, spend the night. Tomorrow you come, we'll take this up again. Thanks, Uriah. You're a good boy. Well done. Now go home. And what happens? Sentence 9. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the royal palace, along with all the other officers, and did not go home. The biblical text says, when they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? And Uriah answers, and this is great. You got to love this story. Uriah says, the ark and Israel and Judah are located at Sukkot. They don't have a house. And my master Joab and your men, your majesty, are all camped out in the open. How could I go home and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As you live by your life, your majesty, I am too loyal a soldier. I'm too good a boy. I can't do that to my friends. Can you picture David? Can you picture how angry he is? Can you picture he's getting furious? What a guy Uriah is, a great soldier, loyal to his friends and commander, loyal to the king. And David is furious, but he still has a few tricks up his sleeve. So he says, remain here today also, and tomorrow I will let you depart. He's not gone down to his home. Let's go a little further up. Can we go up further in the text? There we go. And in the morning, David sends Uriah back, but he sends him back with a letter. And in the letter, what does he say? Place Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest, and then order him to attack and make the rest of the army fall back. Uriah and his troop will be killed. David knows that this is too public already. Everyone is watching. Everyone knows that Uriah is not going home to sleep. He's telling this all in the public court. Everybody's listening. Everybody's snickering. So David sends Uriah back to the besieging the city of Rabbah and back to the war. And he writes the personal letter to Joab, telling him to send Uriah and his troop forward and get them killed. What a king. What a great king, getting some of his own soldiers killed to cover up his sin. Well, it works. Joab sends word to King David. He sends Uriah the Hittite out, and of course falls back the rest of the army. The Ammonites come out, surround Uriah and his small troop, and they're all killed. And Joab sends back a letter to David saying, oh, how sad, Uriah and all his troop were killed. The king may get angry, blah, blah, blah. We don't need to read the rest. What does King David say to him? Joab, don't let the matter trouble you. For the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack, Joab. Be a good soldier and win for me. And don't trouble yourself about Uriah the Hittite and his soldiers. And that's how the story ends, as far as King David is concerned. So what have we done here? David, king of Israel, is having an illicit affair and just had the husband of his girlfriend knocked off. The text tells us that Bathsheba does the proper mourning rituals so everything will look kosher. And then she moves into King David's court. And she is his concubine. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the way powerful men ruled the world in the year 1000. Aren't you glad that everything has changed now? Well, everybody in Jerusalem knows this story, and they're all buzzing about it. But as Mark Twain said about the weather, everybody complains about it, but nobody does a thing about it. Because let me tell you, King David is not the kind of guy you want to antagonize. But David realizes everyone is talking behind his back, and he makes sure that nobody is talking to his face. Until the court prophet, a man by the name of Natan, decides that this is all wrong. The king of Israel is supposed to be a moral exemplar. He is supposed to be the one who enforces God's Torah, who brings the Torah to the people. The Torah is supposed to be the law of the land, not the king's whim. The king is supposed to rule according to God's law. Even the king has to obey God. Yeah, well, except not King Dave, huh? He seems he can get away with anything. Natan decides this is not good. For the sake of the nation, he must speak up. But how should he speak up? As I mentioned, you don't confront King David. David was a powerful man. He knew how to take a sword and run it through your belly. You did not cross him. David realizes that everyone is talking behind his back, but he makes sure nobody's talking to his face until the prophet Natan starts moping around the palace. And he does this conspicuously enough so that everyone, including King Dave, figures there's going to be a showdown. Now, I can picture the scene. I'm telling you, this would be a great movie. Somebody should do this, of how Natan engineers this scene. King David is biding his time. People are talking behind his back. Natan is skulking up and down the palace. He's walking around looking very upset, and everybody is starting to notice. Everybody, including King Dave, is starting to notice. But David figures, what's he going to do? If he confronts me, I'll kill him, and that'll be the end of it. So he waits. David does nothing. David pounces one afternoon. I picture him calling out Natan and saying, I like to do this in a gangster Yiddish accent, because that's how I see David as the Godfather. And I see David saying, Natan, you got a problem? You got something to say to me? And Nathan looks sad and worried. And as David is reaching for his sword, getting ready to chop Nathan in half, Nathan comes up with this story, chapter 12, verse 1. Can we have chapter 12, verse 1, 2 Sam? Right. And he said, this is the story Nathan tells David. And he's telling him this in front of the whole court. There were two men in the same city, one rich and one poor. And David thinks to himself, that's the story? Oh, okay. I like this. I'm listening. Go on, Nathan. And Nathan does. He says, the rich man had very large flocks and herds. But the poor man had only one little ewe lamb that he had bought. And he tended this ewe lamb, and it grew up together with him and his children. And it used to share his food and drink from his cup and nestle in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. One day, a traveler came to the rich man, and he was loath to take anything from his own flock. I mean, the guy had lots of flocks. He could prepare a meal for the guest. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the guy who had come to him. And Nathan says, well, King David is loving this. He's loving this story. Here he has been worrying that Natan is going to confront him over the assassination of Uriah and his adultery. You can switch back to me now. And he would have, and David was convinced he was going to have to kill Natan publicly. And even for an absolute monarch like David and a despot like him, that would be a bit much, because already everybody's talking about his adultery, and it's just not going to look good when he chops Nathan in half. But now this is wonderful, because Dave can pontificate publicly, and we saw from his deathbed scene, he loves that. He does it well. Now, Natan has given him a softball, just the way King David likes it. Now, David stands up and proclaims to his court and his kingdom, justice will prevail. The rich cannot trample over the poor. I, King David, God's servant, will do justice for the people. Let's go to sentence 8. Is it 7? Wait a minute. Okay. 5 days. Oh, okay. David, go back a second. Go back one more. Okay, it gave him the thing. All right, good. So David flies into a rage, sentence 5. And he says to Natan, as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. David is making a great public spectacle. I picture him thundering in Charlton Heston's voice. Tell me who this man is so that I may punish him in the name of the Lord. And I picture Natan milking it. I picture him saying, no, my king, I cannot tell you, for he is a very powerful man, and I fear the reprisals he will make against me. That's not in the text. I'm interpreting here. I'm giving you a little midrash. And David's loving it. And he pulls himself up to his full height. And he says in a commanding tone in front of all the court, this is the kingdom of God and God's laws. And I, King David, am the instrument of the Lord. Rest assured, Natan, that I will protect you from the wrath of this cruel and rich man. Natan, I command you to tell me, who is this man who flaunts God's law and who sins so blatantly? And what does the biblical text say? And Natan turns to David and says, that man is you. And God said, I anointed you, David, king over Israel. And it was I who rescued you out of the hand of Saul. And this is what you do? This is how you take my laws and my kingdom and you sin and you just worry about yourself? You have flouted the command of the Lord. You put Uriah the Hittite to the sword. You took his wife and you had him killed by the hand of the Ammonites. Therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you spurned God by taking the wife of Uriah and making her your wife. Back to me. And that's our story. That is our story in the Torah about King David and what he did and how he was confronted. Notice how Uriah did it, or how Natan did it. He had to do it roundabout, but let me tell you, the guy was shrewd. The guy set up a situation where he could confront David and get away with it. And he did. Any questions or comments?
We don't have anything now.
Okay, good. We don't have anything. Why is this story in the Torah? What's the point? To show us that David sinned? I assure you, every monarch in the Middle East sinned. And frankly, David, as bad as he was better than most. He actually did good for Israel. He was self-serving, yes, and his sons hated him. His older two sons, revolted against him, and he had them both killed. Finally, his third son, Solomon, was the one who succeeded and stayed alive. But David had his sons killed, and he ruled Israel powerful and cruel. And the Torah makes it quite clear that even the king of Israel has to follow God's law. The king of Israel is not above the law. And Natan confronts David and gets away with it. David was totally bamboozled and was too politically astute to take reprisal against Natan. He knew that nothing would happen, and of course nothing did happen. The Bible makes it clear that God punishes David. He makes Bathsheba's child die, and David and Bathsheba lose their child. And they have another child who is Solomon, so their second child. But David is punished, but yet he remains king. So how is it that David becomes our great hero? How is it that David was made into a hero? Most of the kings of Israel were not wonderful people. They were ruthless men. They were, many of them brought foreign wives into the kingdom. And when you brought in foreign wives, you brought in foreign gods. Next week, we're going to read about one of them, Ahab. And Ahab brought in a foreign queen, Jezebel. And she brought her gods, Baals, with them. She was a Canaanite from the city of Tyre. And she brought her foreign gods in. And this seemed to be de rigueur with the kings of Israel. They would have a lot of wives, foreign alliances, and they would worship many gods that were idolaters. And they'd worship our God too. That was a big problem for Israel. So how does David come off so good in Jewish history? Well, you have to jump down to Hanukkah. You all remember the holiday of Hanukkah? Hanukkah was set up by a fellow by the name of Yehudah Hashmonai, Judah, but we don't call him the Hasmonean. We call him by his nickname, Judah the Hammer, Judah the Maccabee. And Judah and the Hammer brothers lead Israel in a revolt against the Greeks in the year 168 BCE. So it's a good 1,000 years after King David. David is long gone. Israel is no longer a monarchy. Israel has been controlled by since the days of the Persians and the Babylonians, ruled by foreign kings, and we have our governors and our rabbis and our whatever we've got as a political leadership, but we have no king. Finally, Judah the Maccabee leads Israel in a revolt against the Seleucid Greeks and sets himself up as king. Now, he doesn't call himself king. He uses another term. He uses a Greek term, which is ethnarch. Ethnarch. He is the narch of an ethnicity, the Jewish ethnicity, and he is the narch, which is a Greek word, as in monarch, one ruler. This is the king of the Jews. What gave Judah Maccabee the right to set himself up as king? Nothing. Nobody permitted it. Nobody gave him permission, and he didn't ask. He just won the war, had a big army, and set himself up as king. And to tell you the truth, nobody seems to have made much of an issue out of it. He was not related to King David. He had nothing to do with King David. He was a usurper. Now, of course, he won the war. He saved Judaism. He saved Israel. He comes off as a pretty good guy. But actually, he sets himself up as king without any legitimacy. He just proclaims himself ethnarch. Judah had the good graces to get himself killed after Hanukkah. Hanukkah is a real event. It happened 3 years after the revolt. It happened in 165 BCE. And Judah and the boys took Jerusalem, and you know the story. They rededicated the temple and set up the holiday, and Judah proclaimed himself king. Judah and his brothers ruled Israel. They ruled Israel for 100 years. And unfortunately, as good as Judah was, and his one surviving brother, Shimon, Shimon the Hasmonean, who set up the monarchy after Judah is killed, they were pretty good. They were decent rulers. But after Shimon, his sons and his grandsons were terrible. In fact, they became little Greek tyrants. They were Jews, but hard to tell because they looked like Greek kings. It was so bad that we don't even, the most famous Hasmonean king, we don't even recognize him as a Jew. That was Herod the Great. Herod from the Jesus story. Well, he was a Maccabee. And that's what the Maccabees had become, vassals of the Romans, they were little Greek tyrants. Their Jewishness was minimal, to say the least. Most of the Jews hated what the Maccabees became after 100 years in power. That's why the rabbis invented the story of the Battle of Oil, because they didn't want it to be a Maccabee victory. They wanted the story of Hanukkah to be about God's victory. So in the Talmud, they create the story of the Battle of Oil to disenfranchise the Maccabees. Well, the Maccabees now are kings of Israel, and everybody hates them. The rabbis particularly hate them. The rabbis are all saying, oh, we got to get rid of these Maccabees. We got to get rid of these Romans. The Maccabees work for the Romans. We have to get rid of them, and we have to get a new king. Well, now everybody began to realize that the Maccabees had no legitimacy anyway. What made the Maccabees kings of Israel? They set themselves up, and they had the Romans behind them. So that someone's asking me the Romans and the Greeks. The Romans defeated the Greeks. By the year 70 of the BCEs, the Romans totally destroyed the Greeks and took over. And the Maccabee descendants just become part of the Roman Empire as little petty kings. And Herod is the worst of them. So the Jews have this Maccabee monarchy, which they hate. Rabbis are becoming more important, and people are looking to the rabbis for leadership because the Maccabees run the temple. The temple is pro-Roman. The Romans, the priesthood is totally in league with the Romans, and the Maccabees are priests. The rabbis lead the popular rule, the popular anti-Roman antipathy. They're in charge of the synagogues, which become anti-Roman meeting houses. Finally, you can now see with the Jesus story what's going on there. Jesus was a rabbi. He had his rabbinic students, which the Gentiles like to call apostles, good Greek word, rabbinic students. And he was not too enamored of the Romans, as none of the rabbis were, nor were they too enamored of the Maccabees. People started saying, we got to get rid of these nasty Romans and their Maccabee lackeys. Well, who should we get to be our king? You remember the wonderful dynasty of King David, the legitimate king of Israel. His son Solomon built the temple. Things were wonderful. It was the good old days. Oh, if we only had a descendant of King David to come on the throne. And in Hebrew, the synonym for king is Mashiach, anointed with oil. Holy oil was dripped on his head. So that they wanted a Mashiach, Ben David, to come from the line of King David, not these crazy Maccabees. We hate the Maccabees. We want a Davidic king, because in 1,000 years, now David was good. And so David becomes Saint David. And we talk about him in Maccabee days as if he was the great king. And we decide that he really wrote all the Psalms, and he was really a good boy, and all those bad things that it says in the book of Kings and Samuel that he did, well, boys will be boys, you can forgive him, because these Maccabees are worse. And so David becomes rehabilitated. And now you understand why for the Christians, it is so important that Jesus be related to King David. Do you think the Jews cared? David, Shmavid, all these kings are no good. We don't like them. But if Christians want to make Jesus be the king of the Jews, who do you have to be related to be king of the Jews? You could be related to a Maccabee, but we don't like the Maccabees. What they want is Jesus to be related to King David, and that gives him legitimacy as king of Israel. And so they make up these whole stories about Jesus being related to King David. What's one of the most famous? What is Jesus called? Jesus is called Jesus of Galilee, Jesus of Nazareth. Where is Nazareth? Where is the Galilee? Up north. Where is King David from? Bethlehem. And so, where was Jesus? They make up this wonderful story. Where was Jesus really born? Even though he was called Jesus of Galilee, Jesus of Nazareth his whole life, where was he really born? Well, his mother and his father had to go back to Bethlehem from the Galilee so he could be born there. It's a fablungent story that's in one of the Gospels, because that's where King David was born, so they have him born, Jesus born there too, even though everybody knows he never went there. He was Jesus of Nazareth. But if he was born in Bethlehem like King David, well, maybe he was a descendant of King David. And so King David becomes rehabilitated and used not only by the Jews who want a new king, but by the Christians who are now desperate to make Jesus a relation of King David so he can appear to be king of the Jews and be Mashiach Yisrael. So at this point, please unmute and let's ask if there are any questions about anything in the whole wide world.
There are a few chats here. Let's see.
You can read them to me, John.
Sure. First of all, from Arnie, quoting Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen. Your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the roof. Her beauty and the moonlight overthrew you. From Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen.
Yes.
Well,
King David had strong appetites, let us say.
Comment from Ilana, you didn't lose your touch, Rabbi. And now here's a question from Leslie Blau. Wasn't there a son, and this is reference to King David, and wasn't there a Sanhedrin at that time?
No, not in David's time. There were no rabbis. David's time, there was, in fact, it's really the religion of Israel in David's time was strange. First of all, if you look in the Torah, it seems that the Levites are the local priests of every tribe, that every tribe has Levites, and that they are the people who do the religious functioning in within the tribal setting, and the Kohanes are high priests above them, but it's not clear that the Levites and the Kohanes have a great deal of relationship. And in fact, if you look at the 12 tribes as they conquer the land around the time of Saul and David, you'll see Levi is not a tribe. The Levites are not a tribe. Joseph is divided into Ephraim and Manasseh, and Levi is no longer a tribe. What are they? The priests. The priests working in the local shrines in every single tribe. So it's not sure if it's a job title or if it's a tribe, because they give you 12 tribes as they divide up the land. The 12 sons, you have Joseph and Levi. But the 12 tribes, you have Joseph divided into Ephraim and Manasseh, and Levi doesn't exist anymore. They're just the priests. So there was no Sanhedrin in the time of David. There was no court. There were tribal elders. The tribal elders used to gather, and these were the ones who made all the decisions. They were the ones who elected Saul. We kind of were a republic. The tribal elders were the senators, and they elected the king. And they elected Saul, and then they elected David. And David he did a Richard III. When Saul was killed, as David engineered Saul's getting killed, the tribal elders went to David, and David said, "Oh, you don't want to elect me king because I want to have a very strong army to defeat the Philistines, and you don't want to give me that much power. And they said, oh, yes, 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 we do, we do. He said, oh, and you don't want to elect me king, because Saul never had the power to tax anybody, and he never had any money, and he was always begging for money. And I'd want to have a lot of taxes, and you don't want that. And they say, oh, yeah, we need you, Dave. Come on, beat the Philistines. So Dave gets himself elected and is a powerful king. And I'll tell you one more anecdote about David's son Solomon, who now has to face the tribal elders to get himself elected. Yes, he's in line, but in Israel, we are a democracy, a democratic republic, and the tribal elders have to elect Solomon as the new king. So Solomon meets with the tribal elders, and they all say to him, your daddy, King Dave, was no namby-pamby. He taxed the hell out of us. He ran the country like his personal fiefdom, and he had a personal army, and he was tough. Shloimeh, what are you going to do? Now, Solomon goes to think about this, and he meets with David's counselors. And David's elder counselors, who are still around for Solomon, say to him, Solomon, get yourself elected by the tribal elders. You'll be king. Do whatever you want. Just play the game, kid, till you're elected. Smile, shake their hands, tell them you have no idea, you're going to need their help, blah, blah, blah. Solomon's friends, the young Turks, they say to Solomon, this is a test. If you don't step on these tribal elders now, they'll walk all over you. But we didn't have a Sanhedrin, we had a council of tribal elders. So Solomon sends word back to the tribal elders, and what does he say? He says, my little finger is thicker than my daddy's thigh, which in Hebrew seems to indicate that my little finger's thicker than his thigh. You think daddy was tough? You ain't seen nothing yet. I'm going to be even tougher. Whereas 2 of the 12 tribes remained loyal, and 10 of the 12 tribes marched off north and elected somebody else to be king. Not Solomon, I'm sorry, Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Solomon, they all elected Solomon, nobody said boo. But his son Rehoboam didn't have the power, and he's the one who did this. He's the one who split the country. But there was no Sanhedrin at this time.
Okay, another question, which I think you already addressed, but why are the sages so kind to David in their recollections? We saw the flaws in Abraham, Jacob, Moses, etc.
Well, don't forget, we tell this story. We tell this story about David, of Bathsheba. And it was because not in his day, and not but in later days, that the rabbis were looking for, they did not want the Maccabees. The Maccabees were Greco-Roman lackeys, and they hated them, which is why Judah Maccabee is the only decent one you ever hear about. And he was only good because he got killed after 3 years, so he couldn't do much bad. But as we were conquered by the Romans, and as life got worse for us, the idea that a king, with Jesus, the idea that a Davidic line would come save us began to be percolating in the country. And people don't realize that 70 years after Jesus, it's about 100 years after Jesus, in the year 132, the Jewish Messiah came. His name was Shimon bar Koseva. Shimon bar Koseva. He was a descendant of King David, and he was crowned king by Rabbi Akiva, and he led a revolt to drive the Romans out of Israel. And it was successful for 3.5 years. And he ruled Israel, and he called himself Mashiach Yisrael, King of Israel, made the Torah the law of the land, and reestablished the monarchy of King David. And by and large, was a good guy. History is not kind to him, because after 3.5 years, the Romans brought 10 legions in, and slaughtered him, every one of his soldiers, and killed everybody in the country, so that he got us all killed. So history is not too good to Bar Kokhba. By the way, his name was Shimon Bar Koseva, but they called him Shimon Bar Kokhba, which means son of a star or lucky boy. So Bar Kokhba was his nickname, and he made the monarchy of David kosher again, so that at that point David became a good guy. And there are midrashim written about him, and we refer to him as the good days when we had our own ruler, because we hated the Maccabees and we forgave Dave. You know, after 2,000 years, they cut him some slack.
Okay, we have some more chats. This one is, didn't Nathan have a relationship with David before this interaction regarding Uriah?
Yes, he did. He was the court prophet. He was the court prophet. Perhaps one of the very first prophets. He was the Navi, the seer. He could see clearly what God wanted. And David kept him in the court. Now, it's not clear if every king had his own Navi, but we start hearing from this point on that there are prophets, and they are throughout the country, and they are speaking for God to the king and to the people. Rabbis do not start. Rabbis come into being with the Babylonian exile. The Babylonians in the year 586 BCE destroyed Jerusalem and carried off the entire population into the city of Bavel. And that's where rabbis begin. You know how I can prove that rabbis come from Babylonia, don't you? That's because rabbis do like to Babylon.
Okay, and one more here. Disdain for the Maccabees led to the Jewish canon leaving out the books of Maccabees. They are found in the Apocrypha. Is that?
Yeah, right. Right. You know, and that's why the story of the bottle of oil. And what do we sing? Not by might and not by power, by spirit alone. That's a very famous camp Hanukkah song, because the whole point of Hanukkah is that the miracle is God's. The miracle that, and they say the bottle of oil, that's, you know, it's really a silly story, because what is the miracle of Hanukkah? The miracle of Hanukkah is that most Jews didn't want to fight the Greeks. They loved the Greeks. They all wanted to be Greek. We were assimilating like crazy, and we loved it. Don't think assimilation is just a modern problem. We always loved it. And Judah and the Maccabee boys said, hey, listen, we want to continue to speak Hebrew. We want to continue to worship our God. We want to continue to read the Torah. And the Greeks were trying to abolish all these things. And unfortunately, a lot of the Jews were going along with them. You know, during the Maccabee times, the Greeks set up a statue of Zeus in the temple. Well, it's not exactly right that the Greeks set up the statue of Zeus. The high priest, Hananiah, who was appointed by the Greeks, he set up the Zeus. Can you believe it? The Jewish high priest set up a Zeus? That's how assimilated we were. Any other questions? So, ladies and gentlemen, the end result is we should follow God's laws, each and every one of us. That political leadership is flawed. None of them are sacred. We have to hold them all to account. And next week, we will hear the story of the prophet, my namesake, Eliyahu, Elijah, and his confrontation with Queen Jezebel and King Ahab.
Okay, where is that?
Where is that?
Yeah.
In the Bible?
Yeah, which reading are we?
Oh, okay. That's next Thursday night, and we are doing 1 Kings chapter 18 and 19, if you want to read the story.
Okay, great.
1
Thank
Kings
you.
chapter 18 and 19. Look at those two stories, and it's a great story.
Great.
First Kings 18 and 19.
Okay, I got it. It's enough.
Very good.
Thank
Ladies
you.
and gentlemen,
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
see
you,
you
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll
Fine, it's
leave
good to
you
see you.
Great
Thank
to see
you.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Nice to be
I
with you
leave
again.
you
Thank
with
you,
two
Joel.
parting jokes.
Hi,
Number
Millers.
one,
Thank you.
Just let me mention, thank you very much, Rabbi. Same time, same place next week, same time, Thursday at 7:30, as the rabbi said. And it's the same Zoom link that you used tonight. And I will send out a reminder with the link again next week, but save that link and you can access the second class with the same link. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, John.
Register.